So I did call my paper First Do No Harm. And as some of you may know, I've been involved in this for about 3 years, a little more now, since I was on the Council of Governors at the Tavistock Clinic, which is I was a staff representative on a sort of parallel governing body. And I think I was known for having concerns about the GID service. And about 10 people, well, first of all, 1, then 2, then 10, which was about a third to a quarter of the whole London service contacted me, some very senior, some junior, all expressing deep concern about the treatment being carried out at that clinic and the damage it was being done to children and the inability to get anybody to listen to them within the trust. And at least 1 or 2 of those therapists was no longer sleeping because they felt they were unwittingly being complicit in causing harm to children. So I'll start just by saying something rather general. All psychiatric disorders occur on the boundary between the individual and culture. That is, there is nothing that is a psychiatric disorder on its own. Everything is embedded within the culture in which it takes place. And some disorders arrive on the scene, rapidly increase as experts and clinics become interested in them and they get DSM diagnoses, and then they wane, and some even disappear, such as false memory syndrome, for example. Although the difficulty is that these different syndromes expressed don't disappear, but they're expressed in another form. And I noticed that a number of people in the chat mentioned anorexia, which of course is also related to a hatred of the sexual body. And a number of young women who I've come across who are detransitioners were also anorexic, but no one had made the connection between their anorexia and their relation to their own sexual bodies. What I have to say now will be divided into 3 sections. In the first, I will elaborate on on some of the issues of children suffering from gender dysphoria, focusing on the serious clinical and ethical concerns, like I and many others have. I'll then discuss some sociocultural factors that may be relevant. That's work in progress in trying to understand the huge increase in children and adolescents being referred to specialist services. And lastly, I want to talk about something a bit different, what I call a peculiar form of thinking, or precisely, maybe as Jude has explained to us, non-thinking, that seems to have come to dominate the discourse in this area. Firstly, an important rider, and the fact that I have to do so is symptomatic of the highly charged atmosphere in which discussions of this nature take place, resulting in important and often highly motivated misunderstandings. Questions about the appropriateness of medical and surgical intervention, most particularly in children, are kept, of course, entirely distinct from questions of discrimination. I say this as there is a pressure for these 2 matters to be elided, which I'll return to later. We're all appalled if any trans person is treated violently or inhumanly or discriminated against. Indeed, many of us, in particular maybe the psychotherapists and psychoanalysts, may have thoughts about what it is that arouses that kind of hatred. Concerns regarding the understanding and treatment of children with gender dysphoria. Some of the things I say here have to some extent been said, but I'm saying them slightly differently. So the first thing to say is that the very word transgender is a useless term because it covers a multitude of different kinds of thing, as I hope we will discuss. And it's very important to differentiate gender dysphoria from transgender. The former then, gender dysphoria, refers to deep feelings of discomfort with the sexual body, which has multiple sources and multiple therapeutic approaches. For example, one can think, as I will talk about shortly, issues to do with sexuality, various comorbid conditions, autogynephilia. Autogynephilia refers to a male sexual activity where a man likes to will dress up as a woman and masturbate in a mirror, being very excited by the appearance of himself as a woman. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that at all, if that's what someone does in private. However, there was some of the people suffering from autogynephilia then moved in to become were drawn into the transgender movement. So that's another sort of route. Transgender refers to those individuals who have completed or are embarking on medical and surgical intervention aimed at altering their sexual bodies. However, services pressured by trans ideological lobbies, by an increasingly hegemonic zeitgeist, fail to discriminate between the two, that is, gender dysphoria and transgender, with disastrous consequences. Now, there are multiple routes to gender dysphoria, and the list is long, but would include the following: the presence of various psychological disorders. And that reminds me of something from your paper, Stella, that you showed figures for suicide, and in the bar chart, one of them was for gender dysphoria. But I just thought probably that bar itself doesn't make sense unless there was some way of differentiating gender dysphoria from other comorbid conditions. That is, in the discussions of suicide and suicidality, if someone has gender dysphoria, they often have many other disorders as well. But the thing that gets recorded in these online surveys is just the gender dysphoria or the transgender, not the comorbidities. So that it's a very false way of representing things. So various psychological disorders, including depression, autism, of course, children who, for multiple and complex reasons, live a lonely and isolated life, feeling they have no place in the world, are psychically lost and homeless. Serious family disturbances common, often with intergenerational transmission of major trauma, such as child abuse in the mother or the maternal line. This is sometimes a source of the mother not wanting a girl child, something that can be conveyed consciously, but often much less consciously to the child. The girl child picks up the mother's discomfort with the girl's sexual body. Some families have suffered other major traumas. For example, families where there's been, say, the death of, say, a female child. And then the dead child's brother suddenly presents as being trans, as being a girl. But what's extraordinary about that is the lack of interrogation of what would be obvious to any first-year psychologist. Is this child identified with the dead child? And is, so to speak, he trying to give the parents back their daughter? Any family therapist would think of that immediately. A very important causal route, well described in the literature, is related to homosexuality. It is not uncommon for a lesbian girl, for example, to think that because she's attracted to same sex, she must, in inverted commas, really be a boy. Some children who show characteristics of being gay or lesbian find this is not tolerated by the family, sometimes overtly, but equally often in more subtle, even unconscious ways. And one of the characteristics of this whole area, and what is quite disturbing that should be happening at the Tavistock, is a superficiality. That is, I said, subtle and unconscious ways. There's a focus on very, very superficial surface phenomena and lack of probing underneath, which, of course, somewhere like the Tavistock it's very bread and butter. The children also internalize this intolerance of their sexual orientation, which again becomes manifest as hatred of their own sexual bodies. Stella said something related to this, and maybe I just put it in a more slightly psychoanalytic way. That is, it's common, it's not universal, but it's very common for girls to become very disturbed in puberty. And one of the ways of thinking about this is that a girl pre-puberty, when she has thoughts about sex and sexuality, may project them into the mother and think of all that disgusting thing that the parents do or the mother's involved with, how filthy and disgusting. And that's in a way defensive and helpful. But then as she enters puberty and sees breasts growing and her body changing, at an unconscious level, that can be experienced as mother's entered her body, that she's losing control of her body. Some alien force identified perhaps with mother has got inside her and becomes a source of great distress and hatred. And a lot of girls have to manage that in various ways, some more successfully than others, but many women I've talked to recognize that. And many studies have shown that a lot of these children will be helped if they're looked after in a proper manner, end up being gay or lesbian without undergoing transition and being gender non-conforming. This also illustrates the way that gender as a category has come to obscure discussion of sexuality and the materiality of biological sex. It was very strange when I did my report of the Tavistock GID service and talked the clinicians that I talked to. They said what was quite extraordinary was that sexuality was never mentioned, only gender. Very odd for a place such as the Tavistock to ignore sexuality. A further issue here, one of considerable importance, is that many young people who are unwilling or unable, and this is what Stella was saying, to conform to gender stereotypes, for example, a girl wishing to be more masculine, are misunderstood as being transgender. Here, medical intervention supports not fluidity, but a rigid binary construction of gender that has a caricaturistic quality. That is, if you don't like, pink ribbons and dollies, you're not really a girl. The massive increase in referrals, which Stella's already showed us, of children and adolescents to the Tavistock Services GIDS. I won't show the bar chart again because you've shown it, but basically it goes from 80 to 2,800 over a period of about 9 years. This massive increase has caused many, has many sources, which I'll discuss in a moment. But the staff who came to me were very concerned about very particular things. For example, the recruitment of staff with very low levels of clinical knowledge and skill, particularly as regards complex disorders in childhood and adolescence. Because of the huge numbers, the need to sort of limit the budget by recruiting lower level staff. Many of those staff had had little or no previous exposure to complex serious disorders in childhood. Other issues that were raised were huge caseloads, perhaps over 100, 140, some mentioned. One psychotherapist said that, family therapist told me that in his previous job, where he'd seen hundreds of children over the years, if you just said one thing like the one whose father was a cab driver and died suddenly, he said, I really remember everything about that kid. But these kids, he said, he can't remember anything because the service felt much more like all the children were the same because they all came with a script and the script wasn't sufficiently interrogated. So it all became one kind of blur. They thought there were unresolved serious ethical issues of what constitutes informed consent in minors. We could discuss that maybe more later. The risks to young children and adolescents of hormonal and surgical interventions without adequate assessment or time or thinking space. None of the adolescents underwent surgery until they were adult, but there are many kids who start on the waiting list as adolescents, but by the time they get near to being seen, they're 18 and sent to the adult service where there's virtually no psychological scrutiny at all. This is all particularly important given the lack of any evidence for safety of the medication, and given now that 98% of pubertal children progress from so-called puberty blockers to opposite sex hormones. And thus, starting them on puberty blockers is putting them on the road to opposite sex hormones and to surgery. Services submit, indeed encourage submission to powerful politicized lobbies who often are very closely involved in the service, such as Mermaids and Stonewall. And the staff had a great fear of being called transphobic. This closed down space for thought, doubt, and exploration. Many staff, there were staff who were taken off cases because they were worried that the child was gay, and they were told that they were just causing difficulties and were taken off the case. Some workers have emphasized to me the problem of guilt in the parents. I think this is quite an interesting one. That is, whenever a child is disturbed, it is inevitable that parents feel guilty, of course. Very painful business, often excessively so, very often. However, if the child announces they are trans and the implication is that this is a biological rather than a psychological issue, then parents in some cases will feel relieved of guilt. Not everyone has due strength. Such parents may actively campaign for the child to transition very quickly, saying they want closure here, and are often very intransigent if any doubts are raised. The implication here is that if the child is not trans, if the problem is, so to speak, elsewhere, the parents are again faced with what may be unbearable guilt. On the other hand, there are parents who express doubt and reluctant to proceed quickly, as Judith discussed, and are often threatened or marginalized in the ways that she has described. Thus, while it is clear that we are dealing with a highly complex problem with many causal pathways and no single causative factor, gender services tend towards a very damaging, peculiar, superficial simplification. For various reasons, not least a huge increase in caseloads, the long waiting lists, leading to pressures to process the children using a procedural model rather than one aimed at understanding the individual case in any depth. The great problem of the Tavistock service is it's a gateway, rather than being separate, it's a gateway to puberty blockers. Of course, alignment with affirmative lobbies, that is, lobbies that seek to affirm the wish to change gender, tending to see it only as a positive choice to be encouraged, acts as an ideological support for this simplification. Many services lack any understanding of and are overtly hostile to any thought about the less manifest, less conscious issues in which ways that they are not for other disorders. So trans is somehow exceptionalized. Even thinking about cause is very often regarded as an act of hostility. For the only acceptable explanation is that the child is literally in the wrong body. And all suffering is secondary to this, in inverted commas, fact. It needs to be borne in mind there's absolutely no evidence at all for this assertion. It's a kind of belief, it's a kind of essentialist belief in some kind of gendered soul. Even mermaids have stopped using that term. We also need to distinguish a child's subjective account from a more external perspective. Patient involvement in decision-making is, of course, a good thing, but that needs to be distinguished from the non-questioning of the patient's account. When it becomes non-questioning, here we see a perversion of clinical care into a kind of customership, where the customer is always right. And this is perversely championed as patient engagement. Some guidelines accept that if a child is disturbed by being trans, then they do need psychological help, with the implication, most peculiar, that if they are not disturbed, there's no need for help. In fact, one could argue the exact opposite. Non-disturbance is more likely a sign of dissociation from the implications of pursuing transition. There's also a tendency, which I think Jude has helped us with, and also Stella's paper, to sanitize interventions, which are presented, discussed in such a way as to downplay their nature and the lifelong implications being a patient for the rest of your life, anorgasmia, infertility. Sometimes it's even made to sound like minor cosmetic surgery, sometimes referred to as top surgery, as opposed to double mastectomy. I recently just heard of a Scottish 16-year-old child who's had a double mastectomy. I and many colleagues have seen adult patients where genital surgery has resulted in, apart from the inevitable complications, further complications because of the surgery going wrong. A number of surgeons are now expressing very serious doubt and concern, as if they're suddenly waking up to what's happened. We've mentioned the geometric increase in referrals, but I would like to draw attention to the rising number of natal females, which is a relatively new phenomenon. It must, I think, be clear that such a rapid escalation of cases, the increase in natal females, the sudden appearance of so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria, cannot be explained by individual factors alone. Nor is it likely to be caused by a large number of individuals feeling at last free to come out in this new liberal atmosphere. It must be derived from sociocultural forces that are as yet poorly understood or even investigated, although we're going to hear from Lisa shortly. It is therefore regrettable that treatment for children and adolescents that has been increasing exponentially without inquiry is being treated without inquiry into this broader determining sociocultural context, where we have no real knowledge of the consequences and no adequate follow-up data. What I offer now is a preliminary sketch of some of the factors that may be relevant to these sudden changes. Now, I'm going to see if I can share my screen now and bring these factors up. I'll have a go. I just leave that up for a moment for you to see, and then I'll take it down again because I'm going to go through them. But those are some of the factors, if you like, a kind of perfect storm. I'll take that down now because I can't have that up at the same time and also read my paper. So I'll stop share. Okay, so first of all, the ever increasing penetration of the market form into all aspects of life reaches deeply into the psychology of the person, where identity becomes reformulated. Identity comes to manifest features of the commodity form. It moves from being something that one lives with or struggles with over time to a more transient structure, which, somewhat like a commodity, is exchangeable. Commodity exchange, because of its extraordinary rapidity, supports the illusion of instantaneous transformation. It should be clear here that I do not mean that a trans person just chooses a new identity without painful struggle, of course not, but only that this underlying sociocultural change acts as a tendential force influencing the way we all think. This transformation is increasingly expressed in the relation between doctors and patients, which degenerates, as I mentioned above, into its perverse form, a celebration of customerhood, misunderstood as democratization. The distinction between need and wish here evaporates. We've been used to a world where a patient requests such and such a treatment, but the professional does not agree, introducing a triangulation that may be welcomed or resisted. However, powerful social forces misrepresent this triangulation as only representing a kind of patriarchal power play. And where this is successful, externality collapses. An analytic patient of mine who mixed in circles, a young man who mixed in circles who didn't know much about psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. One of his friends asked him what psychoanalysis was. And he said, and I was very touched by this, it's like having someone on your side, but not someone siding with you. That's an entirely different matter. And maybe that's an answer to one of the things that came up in the chat about kindness. Siding with someone is not an act of kindness. An act of kindness is to be able to hold a neutral position, a sympathetic position, and maintain that neutrality, which is costly and difficult, but it's an act of kindness. Another major factor was overburdened child mental health services in the UK who cannot cope with a combination of increased demand and cutting of resources, are stretched to breaking point. Faced with children suffering complex, serious disorders, it is understandable that any mention of gender problems can quickly result in a referral to specialist gender services. And in the process, the other disorders are now filtered through the prism of gender, and they can be left completely unaddressed. This can lead to a damaging foreclosure of the ordinary serious disturbance and turbulence and confusions of adolescence. Another change which is perhaps important is transformation in political life, so that identity politics has moved much more into the center. This movement, which certainly starts off life as liberal and emancipatory, can sometimes go through twists and turns and then comes to manifest the very characteristics it sought to challenge. It becomes fixed, narrow, all determining, all critical engagement recast as an enemy to be silenced. Then there's the increasing recourse to medical and surgical intervention. In particularly is true whole loads of stuff online about particularly girls having various surgical interventions to convert their bodies into a kind of sex stereotype. So this increasing medical and surgical intervention enacts a breakdown in the boundary between bodily self and technology. Lastly, I think that in our current conjuncture, we are witnessing a growing misogyny. What I have in mind here is this: since the Second World War up until the late 70s, a strong femininity was expressed, at least in the UK, by the increasing theorization and respect for maternal caring. And in the UK situation, the creation of the welfare state maintained a certain social dominance. However, that version of strong caring has been represented in its perverse form, nanny state, a contemptuous attack on femininity. This is both expressed and reinforced by ideological forms that promote the delusion of autonomous man seeking only to service his own needs, enacting a hatred of all forms of dependence. This growing misogyny may have very profound effects upon girls, and in conjunction with more individual factors, supports the internalization of this hatred of femininity transformed into hatred of their female bodies. And then lastly, the internet and social media, which Lisa Lippman has discussed a lot. So I don't think I'll mention that because I think that's already well described. The last bit of my paper I call a peculiar mode of thinking. I'll here elaborate on some aspects of what I call a peculiar form of thinking that has come to dominate this discourse. As I've already made clear, thoughtful engagement is treated as a kind of enemy, and this is certainly the experience of many clinicians working in gender services. The wish to think over time and understand why this particular child has developed in this particular way comes to be seen as an expression of transphobia. This creates a paranoid universe, a world where you are either with me or against me. That is, there is no room for a mind that just wants to think about things. This intolerance of doubt and thought that characterizes certain kinds of the intolerance of doubt and thought that characterizes certain kinds of mental state here leaks out and becomes a force in the social realm. The term transphobia has for many in mental health services, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, a particular unfortunate resonance, named the homophobia that is a part of our history. I have in mind that dark history of conversion therapies for homosexuals, particularly, though not only in the USA. I believe the fear of repeating this has interfered with our capacity to think through these issues and has led us to turning a blind eye. But it is vital to distinguish between conversion therapy and a wish to think. As I see it, the rapid decisions as regards the provision of medical and surgical intervention is itself a form of conversion therapy. Like the past so-called treatments for homosexuality, it seeks to refashion the body as the only permissible solution to painful conflicts about gender. It brings about transformations in the body, converting it in order to satisfy insufficiently examined individual, family, and social agendas. Lastly, the possession of a particular identity is taken as supplying an individual with a peculiar kind of higher authority. If, for example, a person says, as a gay man, or as a Jewish man, or disabled person, or black person, or whatever, it would be quite reasonable to accept that such a person, because of their specific experiences, will enrich any discussion of the world with which they identify. But this does not bring entitlement to an unquestioned higher authority. That is, by belonging to X group or Y group, my views as to what is true about the world, particularly about the group to which I belong, remains as open to doubt and question as the views of any other person. This assumed higher authority, exceptionalism, exhibits also a kind of entitlement that can in part be derived from the link between a particular identity and victimhood. That is, an entitlement not to be questioned. That is, a demand to be exempt from the ordinary canons as to what counts as good judgment. There can be no personal or group sovereignty as to what counts as true. This is here, I believe, there is here, I think, a link to the attack on truth value that is so characteristic of our age. One wonders if the peculiar intransigence of these beliefs is at times a result of the awareness of doubt that is disowned and projected into the other, who then must be silenced. If we take it as a fact that gender identity is socially constructed, or largely socially constructed, then there is a paradox at the heart of this phenomenon. The apparent freedom or liberation that it expresses is totally undermined by locating all possibility of change only concretely in the material alteration of the body rather than the mind. There's been a peculiar regression in thinking. In our contemporary world, we are generally more tolerant, even celebrate a certain gender fluidity in terms of gender and sexuality. We, at least I suppose in urban areas, are less interested in who a person goes to bed with, less bothered by a man being somewhat effeminate or a woman being somewhat unfeminine. But this exists alongside a toleration of certain limitations arising from the body. But in the ideology of the militant trans lobbies, there's a peculiar rigidity of gender identity, coupled with a belief in the total fluidity of the body, a most peculiar reversal. This is coupled with a peculiar essentialist mode of thought, that is, gender identity is confused with anatomical sex, and so is seen as biological and fixed rather than psychological, social, and fluid. B. Campbell, a well-known British writer and feminist, wrote, "The sexual revolution wrought by feminist and gay activism has, of course, changed the political landscape in which trans lives can be lived. It coexists with the commodification of gender archetypes and the reinstatement of a seemingly polarized and parodic masculinity and femininity." Here I've described how thinking becomes the enemy to be destroyed. Nothing should stand in the way of an unobstructed pathway to irreversible medical and then surgical procedures that result in lifetime medication where we do not know what the consequences are. I will end with a story. As a medical student, I attended a lecture by Hans Eysenck on his electric shock treatment to decondition gay men. In the discussion, a young gay philosopher, as I later learned when I spoke to him, asked if there were not any ethical matters that needed consideration. Eysenck responded that these men were suffering as a result of being homosexual and sought help. We have, he said, the technology to relieve them. There needs to be no further ethical consideration. The questioner suggested a thought experiment. He said, let us just imagine for a moment, Professor Eysenck, that you are an orthopedic surgeon, and that one day a man approaches you complaining, I cannot bear my arm. It is ugly. I never know what to do with it. My wife also hates it. I don't know where to put it in bed. Look, it's covered in bruises. I'm always knocking it. Would you just please remove my arm? Well, said the questioner, I think you might, Professor Eysenck, send him to a psychiatrist to find out what is, and say to him there's something wrong in the relation between the man and his arm. You would not, I think, say we have the technology to relieve him of his suffering and so proceed to amputation. There was a deafening silence in the room. The point here is, of course, is the homosexual man who seeks treatment of this type is not sovereign over decisions as to what afflicts him. For there would be individual, family, and social determinations, including for that, such a man living in a world where hatred of homosexuality would be a daily experience. Things that would affect him beyond awareness. However, the last time I told that story, I was disturbed to learn that in the USA, there are surgeons who will amputate under these conditions. Here, patienthood has collapsed completely into customership, and so wish transcends any conception of need, and externality is annihilated. It is indeed strange to be living in a world where, when I was working at the Tavistock, I received a referral from a plastic surgeon of a man who asked for surgery on his nose. The surgeon had met this man a number of times and decided there was nothing wrong with his nose, but there was something wrong with his relationship with his nose. After a year's psychotherapy, the man discovered, or didn't discover, but more recognized the centrality of the hatred of his father in his life, particularly in relation to some very early traumatic experiences, and understood that his nose was like his father's. He gave up his wish for plastic surgery. Meanwhile, a person with acute gender dysphoria, with only a few consultations, may well find agreement to change her name, commence medication, and be heading for surgical removal of her breasts and genitals. Any questioning foreclosed. It needs to be emphasized here that when someone starts on puberty blockers, for which, as I said, there is no evidence of, we do not know what the effects are. There's certainly very strong evidence of effects on bone, effects on cognitive development, effects on brain development. But also originally when they were being used in this context, there was an idea of an interregnum, that they would delay puberty. But here, even that is not the case, because 98% go on to opposite sex hormones. This means that starting a patient on puberty blockers has all the weight on it in terms of consent of starting them on a pathway which may well be irreversible. Many years ago, when I was young, so not many of you will know this, but if your television didn't work, you might get some wavy lines on it. And you would twiddle one of the knobs to sort of change it so that the lines disappeared. But sometimes you get a message from the broadcaster. Do not adjust your set. There's a problem with the signal. A version of this made its way into a popular political slogan. Do not adjust your set. Reality is disturbed. However, the current predicament is so much darker, as Jude, in fact, has particularly showed us. Serious questions have been raised concerning the ethics and safety of these so-called medical and surgical treatments, which are offering surgical and medical solutions to psychological problems. It is to be hoped that this discussion is part of a critical engagement. There's now a much broader debate in the media and than would have been possible only a few years ago. So maybe the pendulum may be swinging a bit the other way. But there are many beleaguered colleagues who are struggling to maintain thought and ethical responsibility, and they need our support. Thank you.